My stepdad Robert slipped into our San Francisco jacuzzi, his touch under the bubbles too bold, heat exploding. I pushed him away. He didn't stop. His hand lingered, electric, forbidden. What we unleashed next? You'll be speechless. I was sinking into the backyard jacuzzi at our San Francisco house one foggy evening, bubbles churning around me, trying to wash away Mom's endless tech marketing pitches that had clogged my day, when the patio door slid open and my stepdad Robert, a 61-year-old ex-gym owner now managing a fitness center, stepped out, his grin too sharp, like he'd known I'd be here despite my plan to soak alone. I'd told him I'd be out back, so his claim of needing a quick dip rang false, and I snapped at him to find another spot, my voice cutting through the steam, wanting him gone before Mom, on a work call inside, caught us together, her knack for picking up weird vibes. Like that time I dodged her after a late night, making me tense. He didn't budge, easing into the water across from me, saying I looked too stressed for a soak and he could fix it, his tone slick, like he'd been waiting to test me, his arm stretching along the tub's edge, inching closer. I pulled my knees up, saying he'd better not try his trainer crap, my words cold to shut him down, but he leaned forward, saying heat was his specialty, and I'd feel it if I let him, his eyes glinting, too bold, like he'd planned this move. Mom's voice faintly audible through the glass, her call wrapping up. I told him to cut it, she'd hear, but he slid closer, saying she was too buried in slides to notice, his hand dipping under the bubbles, grazing my thigh, not accidental, his fingers lingering like a dare, and I swatted at him, saying he was way out of line, my voice low, sharp, to keep it from her ears, the jets roaring loud enough to mask us, but not the jolt I felt, not just anger, but something I shoved back hard, because his nerve was reckless, and I wouldn't let it land. He pulled back, hands up, saying I'd misread a friendly nudge, but his smirk said he'd meant every inch, and I stood, water dripping, saying he'd regret playing games, my towel slipping as I climbed out, catching his glance before I yanked it tight, hating how it burned in my head. I said he'd better stay out here, my tone biting, and he leaned back, saying I'd rethink it, his voice calm, too sure, like he'd already wagered I'd falter, the jacuzzi's hum swallowing his next words, but I felt them, heavy, like a hook I refused to grab. Mom's call ended, her steps nearing the kitchen, and I bolted for the door, saying I'd grab a snack, my excuse flimsy, knowing she'd spot my flushed face if she looked too close, her questions always sharper than I liked. Inside, she was scrolling her tablet, asking if the jets were too loud, her eyes flicking to my wet hair, like she'd caught a wrong detail, and I shrugged, saying I'd just needed a dip, my voice steady, but my grip on the counter tight, knowing Robert was still out there, his towel folded neatly, like nothing had happened, but I felt his gaze through the glass, a look that wasn't about cooling off, and I turned away, Mom's question about her pitch fading as I headed upstairs, my mind stuck on his audacity, swearing I'd keep him out, because her eyes saw too much, and I wasn't letting his spark catch, not with her so close, not when one slip could unravel everything. She didn't follow, her phone buzzing with another client, but I shut my door, the bubbles echo in my head, knowing he'd try again, and I'd have to push harder, because whatever he'd started, I wasn't letting it take hold, not yet, not when her voice could cut through any moment. For days after Robert's jacuzzi stunt left me on edge, I needed to get to a friend's place across town for a group project, and Mom, swamped with a TED campaign's analytics, waved me off, saying Robert could drive since he was heading out to check gym equipment suppliers. I wanted to argue, my skin still crawling from his touch under the bubbles, but her phone pinged with another client email, so I grabbed my backpack, muttering I'd rather take a bus, though San Francisco's fog and the hour-long route said otherwise, and found Robert by his truck, keys in hand, his smile too easy, like he'd been banking on catching me alone again. I told him to keep it quick, climbing into the passenger seat, my voice flat to squash any ideas, knowing Mom's sharp eye for my mood, like when she'd clopped my wet hair, made me wary of giving her anything to question. He pulled out, the radio humming some classic rock I didn't bother naming, and said I seemed tense, offering to take the scenic route along the coast to clear my head, his tone smooth, like he was doing me a favor, but I caught the glint, same as in the jets, and shot back that I'd rather get there fast, my arms crossed, staring at the city's pastel houses blurring past, the golden gates red peeking through the mist. He chuckled, saying I'd loosen up if I let him talk, and veered onto a cliffside road, claiming it'd beat traffic, though the streets looked fine, his hand on the gearshift, not near me, but close enough to make me shift my bag onto my lap. A shield I didn't want to admit I needed. Mom's text about a meeting delay buzzing my phone, reminding me she'd notice if I walked and rattled. I turned up the radio, hoping noise would drown him out, but he tapped the wheel, saying I'd like his old gym days if I heard about them, nights he'd trained boxers who played dirty, and I said I wasn't here for stories, my voice sharp, wanting him to drop it. But he kept going, saying I had that same fire, the kind he'd spot in a fighter, his words too personal, like he'd seen something I hadn't shown, and I gripped my bag, saying he'd mistaken me for someone who'd care, hating how his nerve twisted my thoughts, like he'd bet I'd crack. I told him to stick to driving, Mom wouldn't like him playing coach, but he laughed, saying she'd never know unless I told, his voice landing like a dare, and I leaned back, saying I'd keep quiet if he did, my tone cold. But my mind snagged on why he thought he could push this, like I'd let it slide after the jacuzzi's heat. He slowed at a lookout point, saying he needed to check his phone for a supplier's address, and pulled over, the ocean crashing below, fog curling around the cliffs, and I said I'd walk if he stalled, not wanting him to think I'd sit through his games, but I stayed put, scrolling my phone, pretending to text, when he leaned across, not touching, but close, saying I'd look good running one of his gyms, like I'd fit his world, his voice low, cutting, like he'd planned it, and I shoved my phone in my bag, saying his world was hers, not mine, my words meant to sting, but a seagull slammed into the windshield, wings flapping, its screech sharp enough to make me jump, breaking the moment, not stopping it, but shifting it, and I laughed, saying he'd scared the damn bird, my tone forced, because his words had landed, and I wasn't pulling away as fast as I should. He started the truck, saying we'd spooked it, not him, and pulled back onto the road, but I caught his glance, quick, like he'd scored a point, and I said we'd better not be late, Mom would ask questions, my voice firm, not wanting her to dig. Her last comment about my rushed exit from the backyard still fresh. I told him to drop me a block from my friends, saying I'd walk the rest, not wanting her to see us pull up together, and he nodded, saying I'd call him next time, his tone too sure, like he'd wagered I'd bend, but I slammed the door, my backpack swinging. The fog thick, his taillights fading as I swore I'd block him, because her questions would cut deeper if I didn't, and his spark wasn't worth the wreck it'd make, not with her eyes already too close. A week after Robert's cliffside drive left me shaken, I was dodging Mom's endless tech marketing spreadsheets cluttering our San Francisco dining room, her voice droning on a client call about ad metrics, when I slipped upstairs to the attic to grab an old box of photos for a school project, hoping to clear my head from his nerve in that foggy truck. I'd been steering clear of him since, determined to snuff out the unease he'd stirred, but the attic door creaked, and Robert appeared, saying he needed to dig out some gym gear for a donation, his flannel open at the collar, like he'd timed his climb to catch me alone again. I told him to make it fast, my voice sharp, shoving a crate aside, not wanting Mom to hear us up here, her knack for catching odd silences, like my rushed excuse after the jacuzzi, making me glance at the trapdoor, her footsteps pacing below, close enough to spike my nerves. Robert knelt by a box, pulling out a dumbbell, saying I'd been avoiding him, and it wasn't because I didn't feel something, his tone not slick but direct, like he'd dropped the games he'd played on that coastal road, and I grabbed a photo album, saying he'd mistaken me for someone who'd listen, my hands busy to keep him at bay, knowing Mom's call could end any moment, her last question about my late return still fresh in my mind. He didn't move, setting the weight down, saying he'd tried to stop, but I was in his thoughts, not just a whim, but something he couldn't let go, his voice low, raw, like he'd cracked open a truth he'd buried for years, and I froze, the album heavy, his words hitting like a spark I hadn't braced for, not just bold, but bare, and I told him to shut it, she'd hear, my voice tight, but my feet stayed glued, because a flicker of the small, dangerous, lit inside me, matching his, and I hated how it felt. Like it belonged, even for a second. I said he was out of his mind, Mom would destroy us, stepping to a shelf, but he rose, blocking a crate, not touching, just close, saying I didn't have to say it back, but I hadn't left, had I, his eyes steady, not pushing, but waiting, like he'd staked everything on my pause, and I shoved the album back, saying he'd pay for this, my words meant to bite, but they shook, because that flicker wasn't fading, and it scared me, how it grew in the attic's dusty light, her voice now louder, calling for a pen she'd misplaced, her tone casual but edged, like she'd sensed a gap in the house's hum. I grabbed a box, saying we were done, but didn't turn my hand on a frame, because part of me wanted his next word, and I cursed myself for it. Mom's steps hitting the hall below, her shadow too near for comfort. She called again, sharper, saying she needed that pen now, and I shouted I was sorting photos, my voice too loud, pushing past Robert to lift the trapdoor, the album left behind, while he picked up a kettlebell, saying he'd finish up, his calm a mask, like he hadn't just tossed a match, his glance heavy, like he knew I'd felt it, even if I wouldn't say. I scrambled down, Mom waiting at the landing, her eyes flicking to my empty hands, asking why I'd taken so long, a crease in her brow like she'd caught dust on my sleeve, or heard a creak too long, details she'd store, and I said the box was buried, I'd get it later. My words rushed, grabbing a glass to look busy, her coffee mug still warm, a marked spreadsheet where she'd left it, signs she'd notice if I faltered. She turned back to her call, muttering about deadlines, but her pause stuck, and I stayed by the sink, splashing water, Robert's confession replaying, not just his audacity, but that spark in me, something I'd never let loose, something that twisted my gut worse than her walking in. I heard the attic floor creak above, his steps slow, deliberate, and I knew he'd wait, sure I'd bend, but I gripped the counter, telling myself I'd end this, keep her blind, because whatever I'd felt up there wasn't worth the wreck it'd make. Not when her voice could shred us, not when I'd already let it go too far. 3 weeks after Robert's attic confession lit a spark I couldn't quite smother. I was itching to escape Mom's endless tech marketing decks cluttering our San Francisco dining room, her voice droning on a late call about ad rollouts, when Robert texted, saying he was testing new equipment at his fitness center after closing and could use my take to nail the setup for a client demo. I'd been dodging him since that creaky attic, wrestling with the flicker of feeling his words had stirred, but curiosity, or something stupider, pulled me, so I told Mom I'd be at a study session, her distracted nod over a laptop screen letting me slip out, though her knack for catching my lies, sharpened since she'd eyed my empty hands post-attic, had me checking my phone, like she'd text the second I veered off course. The gym was dark, its neon sign off, only a backroom glow where Robert waited, his usual polo swapped for a black tank, looking more like the guy who'd built a weightlifting empire than the one stuck in Mom's corporate orbit. And I said his gear better be worth dragging me here, my voice edged to keep control, but my fingers twitched, knowing I'd come to test that spark, even as guilt burned hotter, Mom's last question about my attic delay still nagging. He tossed me a towel, saying I'd try a new rowing machine, no heavy lifting, just feedback, and led me to a sleek rig in a corner, the place silent except for a vent's hum, Mom's text about a late meeting buzzing my phone. A reminder she'd clock me if I walked and rattled, her shadow closer than I liked. He adjusted the rower's straps, saying I'd been on his mind since the attic, not just a passing thought, but something he couldn't shake, and wanted to know if I'd felt it too, his voice low, not pushing, but cutting deeper than his coastal drive jabs, like he'd staked more on my answer this time. I sat, pulling the handle, saying he was digging a grave he'd fall into, Mom would end him if she knew, my words sharp to push him back, but my grip faltered, because that spark wasn't fading, it was growing, and I hated how it fit, like a glove I'd never wear in her light, her call about a campaign glitch echoing in my head. He stood beside me, saying I wasn't rowing away from this, and offered to guide me on a bench press instead, gesturing to a barbell, not touching, but close enough to make the air hum, like he'd turned the gym into his arena, and I was already in the ring. I slid onto the bench, saying I'd lift to shut him up, and he stood above, spotting the bar, saying I had more fight than I let on, his words double-edged, like he'd seen the crack I'd felt on that attic floor, and I pushed up, saying fight wouldn't save him when she found out, my voice biting, but I met his eyes, too steady, because that flicker was flaring, and I wasn't dousing it fast enough, guilt clawing at what I'd let slip. He leaned closer, adjusting the bar's angle, saying I'd surprise myself one day, his fingers brushing the metal near mine, deliberate, not grabbing, the weight light but the moment heavy, until a cleaner's cart banged in the hall, wheels rattling, his shadow passing the glass door, not stopping us, but tilting the scene, and I racked the bar, saying we'd spooked the guy, my laugh forced, because his words had landed, and I wasn't pulling back as I should. I stood, tossing the towel at him, saying his demo was a bust if this was his best, my tone playful to hide how his confession had stuck, and he caught it, saying I'd signed up for more than I thought, his voice calm, like he'd planted a seed he'd watched grow. Mom's text lighting my phone, asking if I'd be home for dinner, like she'd sensed a wrong rhythm. I said we'd better wrap it, not wanting her to dig, and headed for the exit, saying I'd see him at home, my hand on the doorframe, not him, but enough to admit I'd felt something. Her last call about my whereabouts too fresh to ignore. I left, the gym's hum fading, knowing I'd let it go too far, and her questions would hit harder if I didn't stop, but that spark was burning, and I wasn't sure how to kill it without losing a piece of myself. This is Chapter 4, 750+ words. It's distinct, no Jacuzzi's physical grab, drives verbal sparring, or addict's raw confession, but a late-night gym workout where Lena's reciprocation teeters against guilt, with tension from Robert's guidance and her defiance. The cleaner's cart is a subtle disruptor, not a hard stop, and Mom's text keeps her suspicion alive. No cliches, actions, rowing, lifting, tossing towel, and dialogue drive it, not stares or pulses. The gym's gritty vibe leans into the clickbait drama you love, like the Jacuzzi jolt or your push for intense hooks on April 16, 2025, 12:54. Ready for Chapter 5 or any tweaks? What do you think? By midsummer, I was suffocating under Mom's tech marketing decks and client Zooms clogging our San Francisco house, her voice a constant hum about ad metrics, when Robert texted one foggy Friday night, saying he was scouting a pier near Fisherman's Wharf for a gym team building event and needed my vibe check to make it pop. His words breezy but sharp, like he knew I'd been wrestling with the spark his addict confession had lit. A pull I hadn't killed despite my guilt burning hotter since I'd leaned into it at the gym. I should have ignored him, but that flicker, wrong, alive, drew me, so I told Mom I'd be at a late movie, her distracted nod over a spreadsheet letting me slip out, though her knack for sniffing out my lies, like when she'd questioned my addict delay, had me checking my phone, expecting her text to hit any second. The pier stretched into the fog, its wooden planks slick, neon from nearby bars casting a hazy glow, and Robert stood by a railing, jacket open, looking less like a fitness manager and more like the guy who'd built a gym empire before Mom's corporate world caged him. And I said his event better not be a bust, my voice edged to keep my footing, but my hands shook, knowing I'd come to chase that spark. Even as Mom's last text about a delayed campaign buzzed, a warning I sidestepped. He tossed me a coffee from a nearby stand, saying the pier needed my edge to shine, and suggested a quick game of truth or dare to spark ideas, his tone light but loaded, like he'd rigged this foggy stage for me, and I leaned against the railing, saying I'd play if he didn't drag it out, my fingers gripping the cup, wary but hooked, because I wanted to see how far he'd push, even if it scorched me. He started, daring me to climb a stack of crates by a vendor stall, just to stand, nothing wild, and I did, balancing, fog curling around me, saying he'd have to catch me if I slipped, my voice teasing, testing the man who'd claimed me in the attic, and he stood below, saying I'd never fall, his words double-edged, like he saw the crack I'd felt widen at the gym, and I jumped down, daring him to spill what he'd never told anyone, my tone probing, because I needed his truth, not his games. He paused, then said he'd once walked away from a fight he should have won, for someone who didn't deserve it, his voice low, raw, not about Mom, but close, and I stepped nearer, saying he didn't seem like a quitter, my fingers tapping the railing, admitting more than I meant, because that spark was flaring, guilty, reckless, and I wasn't dousing it, not yet, Mom's gallery opening flashing in my mind, her eyes too sharp to miss what I was letting grow. I dared him to name what he wanted most, right now, and he moved closer, saying it wasn't a thing, it was a moment, with me, no one else, his voice steady, not chasing, but anchoring, his hand on the railing, not grabbing, but near enough to make the fog feel tight, and I tilted my head, saying moments like that cost too much, my thumb brushing the coffee lid, a dare I hadn't planned, because I felt it too, and it scared me, worse than slipping, Mom's text lighting my phone, asking when I'd be back, like she'd caught a wrong note from across the city. I said truth, quick, and asked why he'd risk it all, and he leaned in, saying I was worth more than what he'd built, his words slicing, and I pushed off the railing, saying that was no answer, my voice shaky, because I'd leaned too far, and I wasn't pulling back, until a tourist shouted nearby, cursing a spilled drink, his voice cutting the fog, not stopping us, but shifting it, and I stepped back, saying we'd spooked the guy, my laugh forced, because his truth had hit too hard, and I'd answered with more than I'd meant. I tossed the coffee cup in a bin, saying his event was doomed if this was his pitch, my tone light to hide how his words had landed, and he said I'd make it unforgettable, his voice calm, like he'd planted something he'd watched bloom, Mom's text unanswered, Her galleries weighed heavier than I'd let myself think. I headed for my car, saying I'd walk, not wanting him to follow, my steps heavy, the pier's fog swallowing the lights, knowing I'd crossed a line I couldn't unstep, and her questions would carve deeper if I didn't stop, but that spark was burning. And I wasn't sure I could crush it without breaking something I'd only just found. I left the house that night, Mom's screams echoing, her accusations of Robert's past ringing unanswered. San Francisco's fog swallowed me as I walked, my phone dark, no texts to explain. His confession in the theater haunted me, not just his nerve, but my own, the spark I'd let flare. I'd confessed to stop it, to save her, but her rage said I'd broken more than trust. I didn't look back, the city's hum louder than my steps, knowing I'd carry this, a scar from a flame I'd fed, wondering what she'd do with his secrets, and mine.